Something I think a lot of jazz guitarists get asked by non-jazz playing guitarists is, how do you know so many chords? How do you know this B9 and this A flat 7, and how do you know D major like this, and like this, and like this, and like this? Well, I'm gonna tell you how. Okay, this is gonna take a lot of prerequisite knowledge, but trust me, it'll be well worth it. And the first thing you need to know is which note every single fret on the fretboard is. You need to know that this is a B flat, this is a C sharp, this is an F sharp, this is an A. All of that needs to be completely rock solid. And if you're new, it's gonna take some time. Don't worry about it. It'll come with practice. Now, let's say you're just starting out and you don't know any of the fretted notes, you only know the open strings. You know E, A, D, G, B, and E. You can still figure out every single note on the fretboard from there, given enough time, as long as you know how the keyboard is laid out. So you know that from from E, you go to F sharp, to G sharp, A sharp, B, C, no B sharp, and then C sharp, D sharp, and then E. If you know that, then you can figure out what this 9th fret on your G string is, with, again, a little bit more information. So there are tricks like, if you have a fret here, then you can go 2 frets down and 2 strings down to here, and that'll give you an octave, the same note in a different range. So then from here, on the 7th fret of your A string, you should know that that is the octave of the open string 1 string down. So here, and here, to here is all the same note in different octaves. So if you know this is an E, then by extension you also know that this is an E, and this 9th fret on your G string that you're originally trying to find is also an E. And eventually, as you do this over and over again, thinking, what note is this again? Oh yeah, it's the same as this, down to this, so it's an E. Eventually you'll just get a little bit faster at that, till before you know it, you'll eventually just know that this is an E, and right above it is an F, and 2 frets below it is a D. You'll get there eventually, give it a little time. Now, one thing to mention though is that when you're mapping all this out on the fretboard, be aware that between your E and A string is a perfect 4th, between your A and D string, perfect 4th, between your D and G, perfect 4th, but then between your G and B strings is a major 3rd. And so instead of that octave trick I showed you being 2 frets down and 2 strings over, you'll instead have to go 3 frets down and 2 strings over to get your octave. Or instead of it being the 7th fret as the same note as the open string below it, it'll instead be your 8th fret. So just gotta shift everything 1 fret up. And then between your B and E string is a perfect 4th again. But that's the one to watch out for when you're first starting out and trying to map out every note. Next we gotta delve into the very, very basics of music theory. So I know it's gonna be tough for some people, but bear with me here. You gotta know every single interval. And granted, there are only 11, not counting enharmonic equivalents, and enharmonic equivalents are the same thing but with a different name. Like, for example, how this note can be G sharp or A flat. Sharp since it's 1 step above G, or flat since it's 1/2 step below A. It could be the same thing, that's an enharmonic equivalent, G sharp, A flat. On a similar note, you can have an interval colloquially referred to as a tritone, which you might also hear as an augmented 4th or a diminished 5th. Those are the same interval, but different names for it. They're enharmonic equivalents. But you gotta know all 12 intervals. You gotta know where they are on the fretboard in relation to a root note. You gotta know what they sound like. You gotta know, what they feel like. It goes along with what they sound like. And so if I say, play a major 3rd up from D, for example, first, you know where D is because you know every note on the fretboard. And now, for the major 3rd, as an example, that one is 2 whole steps above your root note, or 4 half steps, 4 individual notes. So if you have D here, then you would go up 1 note, 2, 3, 4. And that's your major third from D. And major third sounds like a happy note. But if I say play a minor third, which is 3 half steps up, then you go D, E flat, E, F. That's a sad note. You gotta know all of those intervals, how they lay on the fretboard, what they sound like, how they feel like, all of that. And then again, when you're mapping these out, watch out for that different interval between your G and B strings as compared to the interval between all the other strings that are adjacent to each other. Now the final informational building block of having complete chord freedom is going to be knowing which intervals go into which chords. Now by the time you've learned all the notes on the fretboard and every interval in Western music lexicon, then you probably will have learned a few chord voicings. So let's start by analyzing our trusty, handy-dandy E major open voicing. So let's see what notes are in here. First of all, we have E. Now this is an E major chord. E is our root note. Simple enough, good to go. Next is the 2nd fret on our A string. And because we know every fret on our fretboard, then we know that this is B. And because we know all our intervals, we know that B is the 5th of E. So in an E major chord, right now what we know is an E and a B, a root and a 5th. Let's see what else is here. Next note is another E. You don't need to have multiple E's to make an E major chord. Having more of the same note just fills it out. So right now we're still at E and B. Next note is G sharp. G sharp, as we know, because we know all our intervals, is the major third. So right now we've got E, B, and G sharp. So our intervals in this E major chord so far are 1, our root, our major third, G sharp, and our 5th, B. And these last 2 notes here, B and E. We already had those 2 notes, so this whole E major chord is really just E, B, G sharp. So a major chord is root, major third, 5th. As long as you have those 3 intervals together, that's a major chord. So for comparison, let's take a look at this chord voicing I used in the intro. This is a D major chord. It's got a D, an F sharp, an A, and another D. So you have D is our root note, F sharp is our major third, A is our perfect 5th, another octave of D, so we have 1, major 3, 5. Major chord, major sound. Cool, cool, cool. So if you want to make an E major chord somewhere else on the neck other than down here with our open strings, then all we need are the 3 notes E, G sharp, and B. Our root, our major 3, and our 5. So let's find an E. How about this one here, 7th fret of the A string? Alright, what's the nearest G sharp? It's going to be right here on our 6th fret of our D string. Got a 1, our major 3, we need a 5, we need a B. So here's a B there. We did it! We made an E major chord. Alright, so now we know how to make a major chord. It's root, major third, 5th. Cool, cool, cool. But what about a minor chord? Well, let's analyze a minor chord. How about D minor? It's the saddest of all keys after all. It's a good place to start. So, what's in this chord? We've got a D, it's our root, an A, it's our 5th, another D, octave, don't worry about it, and an F, our minor third. Sad, sad, sad. And so from analyzing this chord, we found that a minor chord is root, minor third, and perfect 5th. Very similar to a major chord, 1 note different. Just a minor third instead of a major third. You might have noticed this if you're playing a D major and a D minor. It is only one note different. You're just changing that third from a major to a minor. So if we want to build a minor chord somewhere else in the neck, we want to make a D minor chord, all we got to do is find a D somewhere. How about here? On the 7th fret of our G string. Alright, we got a D, and then let's look for an F. There's an F, and there's an A. Made a D minor chord. If we want to fill that out a little more, since this is a little sparse, we can look for some other D's, F's, and A's somewhere that's within reach of our limited number of fingers on the fretboard. Well, we've got an A here. We can hit that pretty easily there. Now we've got a little bit fuller chord. Oh, and look, there's another D there. So if I borrow my pointer finger, we've got a much bigger D minor chord. That is still a D minor chord, the same as this is, and the same that this is. Now, what I'm doing when I'm playing these different chords in different ways, different arrangements of those same three notes, 1, minor 3, 5, D, F, A, is I'm playing different voicings. So this is one voicing of D minor, where you're playing your open D string, 2nd fret G string, 3rd fret B string, 1st fret E string. That's one D minor. Here's another D minor that we built earlier. 9th fret G string, 6th fret B string, 5th fret E string. And then you can add to that 5th fret A string, 7th fret D string for another D minor chord. Now knowing that is how I'm able to play a D major here and here and here and here like an intro. Those are all just different voicings of a D major chord. It has D, F sharp, and A. Root, major third, and perfect fifth. That's how you build a triad. A triad is basically just a 3-note chord. Usually refers to a chord that has a root, a third of some kind, either minor or major, or a perfect fifth. But not necessarily, since there are other types of chords. For example, there are diminished chords. And this is one of the trickiest things of knowing so many chords like a jazz guitarist, is knowing what constitutes for indifferent chords. So it's not just knowing different voicings, but knowing chords besides just minor chords and major chords, since there are 7th chords, 9th chords, there's diminished chords, augmented chords, minor chords, add 9, major 9 chords, all of that stuff. And that's just going to take a little bit of rote memorization, but there is some pattern to it. So to learn all these different types of chords, so you can learn a lot of different types of chords just by your own analysis, knowing the information that you already know from knowing all the notes and knowing all the intervals. So if you know a chord voicing and you know what it's called, for example, you know this is an A7, then you can analyze that to figure out what notes are going into it, and so you can figure out how to make a G7 or a D7. So let's start with A7, for example. We know that here's A, it's our root, and then the next note here is D, that's our minor 7th, and the next note here is a C sharp, that's our major 3rd. So to make a 7 chord, we need root, minor 7th, major 3rd. And then already you can see you can put those in a different order right here. So we have root, major 3rd, minor 7. Still an A7 chord. Now what happens if you also know an A7 fingering that's like this? Let's see what's in this voicing. We've got A, or root, E, our perfect 5th, G, our minor 7th once more, C sharp, our major 3rd, and another E, our perfect 5th. Now this chord, you will notice, has an E, a 5th in it, in addition to our minor 7th and major 3rd that this has. This is where things can get a little confusing. Now, our perfect 5th is sort of like a filler note. It doesn't add a lot of harmonic content. If you play this A7 and this A7, it gives you basically the same sort of feeling. Even though this does have an extra note in it, it doesn't add any emotion to the chord. And so what you'll see a lot of jazz guitarists doing is leaving out the fifth in a lot of seventh chord voicings, since it's not really adding anything anyway. And then a lot of times you gotta switch chords really fast, and then the chord voicings are already complicated when you're leaving out notes. So just for simplicity, every now and then you can leave out the fifth. Or even if you're playing in a band and you know the bass player's got the root covered, then you can leave out the root sometimes, and that's where things get a little funky with inversions. Now all an inversion is a chord where a note other than the root note is in the bottom of the voicing, since typically as humans we tend to find our home base in the low notes of a chord. This is typically why even in a pretty complicated harmonic song, maybe especially in a harmonically complicated song, bass players will stick to playing root notes, or if they do vary from the root note, then they'll go to a very safe, benign note like the perfect fifth. So remember when I said earlier for an E major chord that you just need an E, a G sharp, and a B? That's true even if E isn't in your bottom of the chord. So you can have a G sharp like this, and then a B and an E, and even though G sharp is in the bottom and E is at the top of the chord, that's still an E major chord and not a G minor with a minor sixth or something. That's just an E major chord inverted. Alright, so back to analyzing chords. We've got this A7 under our belt, totally good, rock solid. Alright, but what if you see A7 flat 9 or something like that? Don't the intervals only go up to 7th? Well, yes and no. So, if we're counting intervals on the major scale like we do, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8 would be like our octave. No one calls it that, don't worry about it. But we could keep going from there. Now, we have our second again. It's just that second, an octave up. But you could call it a ninth in a sense, since we have 7, 8, 9, and a lot of people do. Now, part of the reasoning for this is that nines don't really sound that good a lot of the time when they're right next to the root, because it gets sort of dissonant. It's not a great sound, but this is better. Kind of lovely. So, we have here what some people would call a ninth, and then above that, 10th, no one calls it that, don't worry about it. An 11th, you'll see that one. 12th, never used. 13th, you'll see that one. And then a 14th, you'll never see that one. And those are what you might call extensions. So if we have an A7 with a flat 9, well, our 9 is just our second repeated, maybe in the upper structure of the chord. And if it's flat, then we just take it down a half step, and there we have our flat 9, B flat, right on top of our A7 chord. A little crunchy. Alright, so that about covers it. If we know all of the notes on the fretboard, we know all the intervals, and then we know how to analyze chords, then anytime we learn a new chord type, if we learn half diminished, a fully diminished, augmented, sharp 11, then you'll know how to deconstruct that chord and then revoice it in whichever way you want. And so you'll be able to play essentially an infinite number of chords, whatever your fingers will allow on the fretboard. It's going to take time, just hours and hours and hours and years of practice. But gotta do it.